Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Covenant Cast. I'm Zach.
And I'm Steven.
And I'm Robert.
And today we're talking about Games Workshop. All right, so like we do, we like to review the answers from last week before we dive into the new show. So you guys are great enough to leave us comments when we ask you a question at the end of the show, and we're going to read some of those comments and discuss, and I'll kick it off with Steven over here.
All right, I asked about PAX Unplugged, a convention that, it's Penny Arcade Expo. It took me a long time to realize that. Yeah, it's like Penny Arcade. Wow.
Cool.
Anyway, Chit Talk said PAX Unplugged was really great. There were a ton of cool tournaments to watch, a lot of people to chat with, games to demo, etc. The timing was a little strange because it fell right between Gen Con and Essen. And if you can make both of those conventions, God bless you. That is incredible. I would love to be able to have those two as the bookends of convention season. So publishers had either already dropped something or were about to the following month. So basically at PAX Unplugged, there wasn't a lot of new exciting things because they were either already announced at Gen Con or holding them for Essen. Either way, it was still a fun time. I met up with some people to play Netrunner and had fun wandering around and meeting new people.
Sounds good.
So all right, sounds fine.
Yeah, I feel like I'd want to go to PAX Unplugged at some point.
It seems like the kind of convention that's going to be a laid-back, game-focused, like the playing of the game-focused convention rather than a retailer or game manufacturer.
Here's the new stuff coming out.
Yeah.
It's more just about actually meeting up with people.
It's more about the folks.
That's right.
Which is great.
The folks.
What about you, Robert? We got technology. There was a lot of good comments about technology, by the way.
Which I love.
Yeah, so
I still love.
You're a fan of it?
last week we talked about tabletop and technology.
Who's going to get that joke? I'd love to know. I'd love to know who gets that
If
joke.
you get that joke, leave it in the comments. But and we asked how you guys would like to see, or how all of you would like to see technology change tabletop in the next decade.
That's right.
Really good answers.
The Johnny is on the table said, I would love to see technology in the form of augmented reality. It would be so incredibly cool if we could have a special glass that when we placed our Pokemon cards on the table, the Pokemon appeared in 3D and did its stuff. Golem Arcana was a good first step into this kind of thing, but we are not there yet. The world of Yoo-hoo, just kidding, is a chocolatey delight, excuse me, just kidding again, is a second great step.
I was like, wait, it doesn't say that.
Is a second great step and much better handled than Golem Arcana. I hope developers keep pushing that route, and when we have the right tech, this can be huge for a lot of different games.
Yeah.
How do you feel about augmented reality?
I think it's fine. I ultimately would err on classifying it as something of a gimmick, perhaps, but that's just me.
So far.
Yeah, so far. So far.
I think that's what, for me,
The glass thing with the Pokemon, ooh, that'd be pretty damn
like
swell.
isn't that the Star Wars thing? Is that the where you put the thing on the table and it shows up? Or is that what the chess game that they were playing?
I had it last week. I had the names down. There's a couple different games that are experimenting with this where it's like you put the card down and then the creature's actually there.
Oh, yeah?
That you're playing. Like even in Magic, the thing that you cast will be there. But then it's also got like
That'd be cool.
Yeah,
the
I'd like
health
that.
bar above it kind of stuff going on. And like when they attack, they kind of doing the attacks or
Getting
whatever.
MOBA over here,
But I think to me,
It's sort of like Yu-Gi-Oh, like in the series, right? Where
Like
you
the
play
actual-
the card and
sure.
then things show
And they're
up.
just playing cards in Yu-Gi-Oh, right?
Right.
Like even in the show.
Yeah, they're just playing cards.
Yu-Gi-Oh is a
it's just
show
on the
about
big
the card
board.
game.
About playing cards.
Yeah. So, but the thing about
successful card game.
weird, that really worked out for them. But I think for me, the reason it feels like a gimmick is that you have to in every case so far, you have to wear something or watch a screen to see the stuff
do
happening.
this pin and
or
scan
your phone,
business.
and we've seen some of that with X-Wing with the arc demonstrations or whatever. But the trick is if you look at Star Wars where they're playing chess or the Zarak, which is the three-dimensional things popping up without having to wear anything, is when I feel it stops becoming a gimmick.
Yeah, I would
Where
agree.
it's
At that
if it
point,
can
we just call it
project.
reality, right?
That's
It's
right.
actually happening.
If it's actually
Red pill,
happening
blue
in front
pill
of you.
time.
Zach.
Yeah, so mine is from Daniel Vincent, answering the same question. He said, I want to see technology embrace rules and balance changes. I'm a big miniatures player and would kill for X-Wing 2.0, where you buy the ships. They maybe come with the dial and tokens, no card bases that are numbers or letters. App sits next to the playmat ship. Z is Luke. They find a problem with Luke. They can change him up, send you a notification version changes, and so on and so forth. I'm spoiled from joining Guild Ball before Season 2 and watching the Season 3 deck fakes. So many problems. Let's make iteration in competitive games even faster. So fast that they can try changes, and if oops, well, change it again.
Yeah, that's right. This makes all the sense. If you had instant access to patch something like that, and if you set your game up to be patched like that, that'd be really cool. Even like he's talking about getting a notification on your phone that says, hey, the X-Wing's been updated.
Yeah.
Check it out. It's got an extra attack now.
Or, you know,
Great.
if you had that app or whatever, and you had an X-Wing list built, it could have a little thing next to it that says something about your list just changed.
And just one of the strongest elements of electronic gaming is that ability to patch. If they could do anything to bring that into tabletop, that would be awesome. Because there's always going to be something missed, an exploit that you need to correct, that kind of
At the same time, I'm glad that we're talking about that, especially following it up with this Games Workshop discussion, because you think about the kind of traditional idea of tabletop gaming, and maybe, you know, pursuing solutions that are all about patching a competitive environment is not even the point.
Sure.
Right? And I think that's what maybe we'll get into here, starting with 1975, where, you know, you're not iterating on the balance and the rules changes as much. You're simply kind of producing a place where the imagination of the players can more or less like kind of have some boundaries, but not really balance anything so much. So I'm happy to
Top
get
down.
into that. I'm ready for it.
Not bottom up.
Well, we're about to get there. Before we dive in, anything notable happening this week?
Yeah,
for the two
well,
of you?
I meant to mention it last week. We had the first L5R novella show up
that's right.
out of nowhere. Classic.
Looks
classic
great, too.
announcement.
Yeah.
Here's this thing out of nowhere.
The Phoenix Alt Arts look.
I think it's some of the
Stellar.
best cards that they have ever
Unbelievable.
done. I think FFG, that is the best 2 cards. Usually they nail one, and one of them is awful, or
real
not
sleeper. Yeah.
quite so good.
Piet great.
But
Yeah.
this one, both of them are incredible, and you know, they're really pushing this novella to get cards idea, and you know, which tail is wagging which dog on
And
that.
they did the Arkham novella not that long ago, you know,
Right.
so a few months back.
Second one,
2 of them.
And they've
Yeah,
done
they've
two.
now.
But the interesting part for me was a lot of the Arkham players, there were 2 main camps, which is, oh, this is great, and then there was, I can't believe they're making me buy a book to get these cards,
Right.
kind of a thing. And with L5R, I was really happy and surprised that it was mostly the first camp, which is,
Interesting,
this is
yeah.
awesome. And that may very well be that a lot of the L5R is based on the story and the fact that these story changes resulting from tournament results and worlds and all this kind of thing. So, you know, if you win worlds for your clan and you get to make a story choice, and then that story choice becomes a novella,
that's pretty cool.
that's
it's
pretty cool. That's
cool.
that's
Pretty cool.
happening. Yeah.
I was glad to know that the L5R community seemingly is so story-driven, and it makes sense. You know, that probably kept that game going for so long. I mean, obviously that's what did it on the CCG, but that's really cool to see that you're genuinely interested in the universe. For like Arkham players, if I can speak for myself,
You can.
the game is so good
luck.
that you oftentimes don't have to care about Arkham at all.
Correct.
The Arkham files, as it were. And so I think that's where you got a lot of pushback on the Arkham novellas. A lot of people got into this game because it's the best cooperative game you can be playing right now, regardless of the mythos. So it's like, just give me the cards, don't care about the mythos. With L5R, it's more of like, genuinely care about the world, and so now here, let's play a card game in it.
And genuinely care about my clan. And that's where it's like, it's a Phoenix-based book, so the Phoenix players are probably very
Overall,
excited
more
about
fan
it.
involvement, and even with Arkham, you know, there's no pre-existing heritage of having like inspiration and source material coming from the likes of God, what's his name?
Lovecraft?
Lovecraft, thank
Yeah.
you. Who, you know, is never going to be remotely touched or eclipsed in terms of overall quality or significance. So if somebody else wants
That's
to come
true.
along and write some extra stuff for L5R, it has far less, you know, precedent to go against.
Yeah.
That's
well,
true.
and I also think that Arkham players aren't contributing to that story. Like you're
Yeah,
telling
it's
a
all
story
written,
being told
yeah.
for you in this campaign. Whereas L5R, you are actually like actively contributing to that history and the building of that story. So that may be another difference in that regard.
Yeah,
So on that note, the L5R Novella subscription has happened. So we're now doing a subscription for that. So if
Same
you're an
with
L5R player, and Arkham, of course, we've had for the past 2, if you are an L5R player and you want to get those novellas with your subscription, just get them sent to you whenever they release. It's actually one of the better, maybe one of the best subscriptions, simply because this is the kind of product that you just never know when it's happening. You never know when it's going to be announced.
When,
you
if, or
never know
whether.
when it's going to show up. You very rarely know anything about these non-core products for the
Yeah.
LCGs. So in terms of a subscription, it's great. It could just be like, oh, it's a good Saturday. I got my novella randomly in the
Here's
mail.
my new
Sweet.
novella.
We also got on the website front just a cool little thing. Anybody who's used the waitlist on our website, potentially maybe for the Mythos boards or
Upcoming Saga sets.
Mythos boards or Saga sets, yeah.
Mythos boards.
Which we can't seem to keep in stock, unfortunately. All of that is now collected on a tab in the account section. So if you have a sign-in on our website, you can check the back end of your account and it will have everything that you have signed up for on the waitlist. So some little tweaks going on. We've got some big rebuilds happening as well. And then Saturday I celebrated Valentine's Day and it was great. Italian food, rarely eaten, oft loved.
What'd you order?
It was essentially, it was that limonada, lemon something.
Limoncello?
Yes, but that's more boozy. But it was essentially angel hair pasta, creamy sauce, lemons involved, capers. It was kind of like a carbonara, right?
What was it? Yeah, where
Where was this at?
Tucci's.
Tucci's.
Cherry Street.
I like
I think
Tucci's
it's
a lot.
number one
Yeah.
for me. number one.
The atmosphere is
Yeah.
Top
Yeah,
of the A-list.
that's why you go. But you know, they do the whole thing. You get the salad, you get the bread, you get the dessert, you
Get an antipasti?
everything. No, because Shannon just isn't into olives. And for me, if you're
What?
not, if you don't do it, we got stuffed mushrooms though.
Oh, that'll work.
Yeah.
Hell.
So
you
that-
immediately redeem
that's what we
yourself.
do. Yeah,
Chef
but I would
plus.
have gone for like the olive cheese, opportunity. But
Yeah.
she would never have gone for that.
Yeah.
Choose your own adventure.
What about you? Who's up?
What was your week like, Robert? Fancy?
Fairly uneventful, fortunately. But let's see. I saw the Black Panther film.
Oh,
I
how
haven't
was
seen it
that?
yet.
Tell me.
It was fair. There were a lot of good things going on with it, but I'm something of a snob when it just comes to assessing movies for like what are they fundamentally doing as movies. There was some stuff that was unnecessary, if not overplayed, because Marvel formula. Here's a guy in a techno suit, and his first villain is going to be another guy in a very similar techno suit.
Yeah.
Just like, okay, proud we are of all of them. But on the whole, it was very good. It was very entertaining, stunning to watch visually, all that kind of thing. Would recommend. Most people should very much enjoy
Was it stunning in the same way that was it Doctor Strange or what was that? What was that one guy?
Yeah, Doctor Strange.
Yeah,
Was
Doctor
that
Strange.
moving the
Cumberbunch.
scenery around and all of that.
Yeah, it was not quite as fantastical as that, but it was incredibly vibrant. Just a lot of awesome scenes and a lot of really astute blending of Pan-African culture and all that kind of
Nice.
stuff. So it was sharp.
How to compare it to Thor?
Ragnarok
Yeah.
or Thor
That's like
Ragnarok?
one of his favorite movies.
For Ragnarok, for the kind of movie it is, essentially, like a buddy flick, comedic buddy film, is one of the finest of that genre that I've ever seen. I mean, just an absolute riot. The Black Panther movie was good enough for a intro piece for a superhero, but certainly not nearly as good as Iron Man or some of the other ones.
Final question. Would you rather watch it again or Last Jedi again?
Oh no, definitely Black Panther. My goodness.
Yeah.
Got him on record. All
My
right.
goodness. No, thank
All right, well, so segueing from that, my week, main thing for me, besides just more Destiny, which is normal, is I went to see a play called Harvey. My sister-in-law Hannah's in it, and
nice.
it was really
What's it about?
great. It was about this older gentleman and his sister and his niece live with him, but they are trying to hide the fact that he has an imaginary friend, or imaginary, maybe not, that is a 6.5-foot bunny. And so he walks into a room, lets his friend in, he's talking.
Is his name Frank?
His name's Harvey.
Oh.
Anyways, but it's really the two things that stuck out for me about the experience were, one, he's the kind of person that wherever he's at, he really is just there.
Sure.
And he's very
Wherever you
enjoying
go.
the moment, right? So like he's going to a bar or he's interacting with people, and it's just like just constantly fascinated with his surroundings and the people, which is cool. But then the other thing was, I haven't been to a live entertainment or performance like that in a while, and it struck me how much different that is than like watching TV at home or something.
Yeah.
And I rather enjoyed it. Like there's
wow.
there's a realness to it. And you-
Literally.
These are tangible people.
no, but I mean it's like.
And they're alive.
It's like you don't realize how produced or fake something feels until you experience a real thing.
Sure.
And I was sitting there, I was like, man, like there was real, like real emotion happening. You could feel it, and there's something different about watching that on a screen versus like in real life. So
And it was musical, non-musical? What
non-musical. It was just,
comedy, drama?
I would say comedy.
Okay.
But like,
Shakespearean
No,
or like
it's-
I Love You Man?
No, neither. Option C, please. No, it was funny, but it was like also semi-serious. But it didn't take itself too seriously, I guess.
No, that's
it's just
always
about a
good.
guy who has an imaginary friend walking around.
Yeah.
And the comedy that ensues because there's these two people who really care about what people think about them, the sister and the niece, trying to hide that fact from everybody. And like the links they go to try to hide that are really extraordinary.
That's funny.
All right, let's dive in. Games Workshop.
So excited about this topic. This stemmed a little bit
GW.
from the state of tabletop, history of tabletop. We've kind of hinted around this topic. Why it's so fascinating to me is that Zach and I came into the industry from a side door. We got in through essentially kind of Pokemon, Dragon Ball Z, collectible games.
Bizarro.
Yeah. So like, properties that we were already invested in, and then, there's this card game, and look, now we love card games. And that then led to other things. Board games eventually were like, look, this is a thing now. Tabletop miniatures games.
Our first-
Didn't
I
have a
guess-
lot. Mage Knight, I guess, was the
Knight-
first time I saw a
But the
miniatures
first one we
game.
really got into was Monster Apocalypse.
Yeah.
Like really into.
And that's not
2008.
modeling, that's not painting, that's not clipping. There's none of the hobby aspect.
Even Rune or Mage Knight was.
Yeah.
Yeah,
None of that.
no
It's
painting.
pre-assembled painted.
And even though I played D&D at starting at a very young age and did a ton of role playing all throughout my life, it never transitioned in any way to miniatures.
Yeah.
We always just had conflicts. Everything was just imagination. We weren't often even at a table. Like, you were sitting on a couch and you'd roll a die on the floor, right? So we didn't even think to draw up maps most of the time, and like have things on them where we could actually see it happen. It was a much more conceptual experience when we were role playing. So I kind of just missed this entire side of the hobby.
Yeah.
And now I'm beginning to fully appreciate how critically important it was to the very beginning of everything.
Sure.
And I think that has a certain amount of respect that should be given and shown, and going from there to evaluating it where it is now, which is went down, kind of had that rebirth process, and now is seemingly in a better place. And talking about why and how that happened is something that, as industry interested people, I think that's a very important lesson to look at and potentially learn from.
Sure.
So,
Well, and I think we did the state of tabletop, and now we're focusing on a single company, and we'll likely focus on other companies in the future.
Look at everything.
But it's a pretty good place to start, just because their history is so long and storied.
Yeah.
So they ultimately started back in 1975, which is, to put that into context, this is before the existence of Star Wars, which is like my
I thought that
North
was kind
Star.
of, I thought that was the origin story of the universe.
It's Star Wars, yeah. It's like, what came before Star Wars? No one knows.
Alec
But
was
I
just
mean,
doing
that's
other
it's,
work.
it's that long ago, right? It's like it is a very long time ago, and it's one of the oldest companies in the gaming space. So it makes sense that we'd want to start there. And so it does bring up, their history is very long. They have been a very big part of the industry. A lot of the things they have done have shaped and changed how everything is done, whether or not we knew it at the time when we were getting in, or even now.
So you think about some of the trends that were set very early on. Like they were producing their typical like board game components, like the high-end kind of just gaming stuff, the backgammon boards we talk about sometimes.
That's where they started.
Yeah.
They started making
That-
these wooden boards for like
Just classic
backgammon
Yeah.
and stuff
game
like that.
stuffs.
And just I listened to a speech that one of the founders was giving at some random, like a TED Talk kind of situation, talking about staying in girlfriend's apartment, making these things, not having like their phone number was the company's phone number, their apartment address was the company's address. People would come expecting a retail store or something, and it'd just be a guy giving you D&D out the front door, right? So one of those kind of just very scrappy stories, but really started getting some traction with this Owl and Weasel magazine. And
Which is really cool.
even now you can see how that medium still has a bit of a hold on the industry. You still have magazines and Game Trader and these kinds of things that are dedicated to, hobby purists and getting information to them. And at the time, that was the only real way to start connecting these various people across the country that were interested in a very new and potentially crazy thing that is Dungeons and Dragons, right? Very bizarre. Like this is not something that has a history of normalcy in any way, right? It's like, hey, we're going to make some characters and it's going to be all in our imaginations. And everyone's like, I'm interested, but where's anybody else in this? So they start this newsletter, Alan Weasel. That becomes White Dwarf Magazine, which we've probably all seen. Interesting part about White Dwarf, apparently that was done because at the time, fantasy and sci-fi were essentially mixed together.
Yeah.
So a White Dwarf star hits your sci-fi people, and a White Dwarf given the fantasy element.
Double entendre.
So there you have that. So this magazine is then starting to connect these people interested in the kind of fantasy miniatures world, right?
Yeah.
And they all start at least getting together.
Tying them
through
all
this
together,
magazine.
yeah.
Well, and it's also cool because to me it seems like a very, very early version of what we're seeing today, which is newsletters, blogs, YouTube content. But it's this reality that creating content around a topic and sending it to people is a way of connecting people and getting them interested in building this hobby, right? And so they were doing this. I mean, this is so long ago.
Well, the biggest deal for Games Workshop up front, where it really took off, was Dungeons and Dragons. Them being the sole importer of D&D from America
to Europe.
To Europe, yeah, to Great Britain specifically, I think. And so they were importing these books. They were the only source of these D&D things. And then they would sell out, get more, sell out, get more, sell out. That happened so much that that's essentially why they started the first store. They needed a place to put all the D&D stuff that they were selling out of the apartment, essentially, as I understand it.
And so that actually happened in 78, right?
Yeah.
So they opened a door, and the note here is that there's pictures of people standing outside.
Classic picture. Games Workshop,
The
a bunch of
store.
people out
Bell-bottom
front.
jeans.
To buy Dungeons and Dragons.
Everybody, the talks and the seminars that I listened to, they said that the majority of that crowd was there for Dungeons and Dragons. Miniatures weren't even a thought.
Hadn't even come into its
Maybe
time.
some history-based, war-based minis.
Well, and there's a reason for that. So, like, in 1979 is when Citadel, which is another company that's been around for quite some time, was founded. And this company, the more you dig, it's funny.
It's a branch of Games Workshop.
Yeah, the Games Workshop funds
it.
And Citadel is all about making miniatures and eventually gets into making paints for all these things. But it was literally, I mean, we're 4 years into Games Workshop before miniatures are really becoming a thing.
You know what the Games Workshop brand was focused on? Retail. They were dedicated to
Forever and
retail,
always.
and Citadel was dedicated to manufacturing, miniatures, etc. And they were trying to keep the two separate.
Yeah.
And it's like, I did not know that retail was the origin point of this whole thing. Not that the retail store was, but that the company was specifically focused. The retail store didn't arise out of these goods and games being produced and people getting together.
Yeah, it wasn't like,
Specifically was focused
hey,
on
we
retail.
make miniatures and games, now let's sell them.
Right.
Like through retail chains or whatever. It was literally, we have a store, we're selling someone else's products, and then it was like, well, and then we noticed people are playing miniature or playing Dungeons and Dragons want miniatures or using miniatures.
Yeah.
So you start making miniatures for them to buy, right?
It starts happening.
And then that leads to the next big thing, which was 83, Warhammer Fantasy Battle comes out.
And two things that happened before that are crazy important. They got the rights to start printing Dungeons and Dragons instead of importing it, which
That's
is
a big
insane,
deal. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so then even the UK audience had books that weren't available in America.
Crazy.
See how that goes now,
Yeah.
right? So now you have this double-sided exchange going on, and if you're selling in your own country, printing the stuff, you make way more money. The margin's way better.
Yeah.
So that's happening. And then you also have the kind of historical miniatures thing is starting to swirl up in all of this as well, kind of coming from the same place. And now a lot of that crowd is kind of intermixed with D&D. And Raoul Partha Miniatures is who they license with, which I remember seeing. Like when I started playing,
that name floating around, yeah.
I was in one campaign where we used miniatures in D&D in high school, and I remember going to the Raoul Partha site to like look at various miniatures, and it's like this stuff just is all connected. It goes all the way back to the very beginning. So,
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry. So Warhammer
No, you're
Fantasy
good.
Battle, yeah.
Yeah, so they put out
WFB.
Warhammer Fantasy, which would go on to be a pretty big game, and a lot of people would play it for a long time. But I mean, you're literally 8 years in before Games Workshop produces their first game, right? It goes from making wooden boards, we're doing a newsletter that we're printing, then we're doing a magazine instead. Now we're the exclusive European distributor of D&D. Now we have the license to print D&D. Now we make a company that makes miniatures, and then now we're making our first game.
And let me set this scene for you. You're one of these people who's been playing Dungeons & Dragons, interested in this kind of world that's developing. You get your issue of White Dwarf magazine, and you see your first ad for Warhammer Fantasy Battle. I think the world
Revolutionary.
changes
Yeah.
right there for you.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, look at
Wait
all
a
these
second.
miniatures on the table. It's a game specifically about this zoomed in
This
moment.
universe, yeah.
Well, and
Easy.
unlike
Unbelievable.
Dungeons and Dragons, where you have to have someone create the story and lead this thing, it's a game that you play. You just play, right, and it's in front of you. It's not, oh, I have to construct the story. You play the story.
Yeah.
Like you just play it. So it's a radical thing to put out.
And it's a completely different medium. I mean, D&D is this intangible, imagination-based experience, but this is fundamentally miniature-based.
Something you can dig your teeth
Yeah.
into, quite literally, if you wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
Also, though, at 1983, this is apparently the biggest year for D&D on the books, adjusted for inflation, ever.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe got beat by when 3rd edition and 5th edition, respectively, were announced.
Those are big additions.
But big years.
Those may have been the biggest, but like that's to tell you the frenzy that was building around Dungeons and Dragons at that time. Huge.
And as looking at this as a business, one thing I want to note about this as well, the change here, right? And that if we do Wizards and Magic in one of these topics, it'll be the same in '93 when Magic
Spoiler
hits.
alert.
But the reality of before this game, right? Before Warhammer Fantasy, you maybe bought miniatures to play D&D. You had a character, you maybe bought the villain, or random things. But like both as a miniature war game, not really a big thing that exists right now, but also just the whole hobby factor of this, where it's like there are people that buy models, put them together, paint them, rarely play if ever. But this is just the hobby side.
Right.
And this is really the beginning of that, which for the Games Workshop business, right? If you have Citadel, who's making miniatures, and you have Citadel, who's making paints at some point, having a game that a huge part of this game and the hobby is buying the models, putting them together, and painting them, not just the handful you might buy for your RPG session, means that a person might go from buying 5 or 6 models a year to now what we see with
Hundreds.
40K, which
Thousands.
is so much.
Just a catalog,
That allows
honestly.
for an absurd amount of things. Not only does that give Games Workshop resources to expand and do more things, but it also means that retail stores are more likely to want to carry this, to support this, because this is a product that once people get into this community is worth supporting. It's a game that will build a community and provide. And so,
And even at the time, the retail store was Games Workshop, right? Like I don't even know if there were other entities that you could reach out to and say like, hey, here's this thing. Maybe comics were starting to really
but as
do
a
their
retailer,
little thing. But
this is a critical product for them.
It's a big difference.
And you have that old heritage of basically history miniatures, right? People putting together little, Civil War figures or, World War II and your planes and whatnot, and never playing them.
They were just for display?
Putting them on the
That
table
whole
or
hobby
displaying them.
mixed
And
with a
it's-
game, right?
And so you throw the two together and it's like, boom, there's magic.
So then you advance. I mean, I think the next real big thing is 87, we get 40K.
Yeah.
And so Warhammer Fantasy is obviously the Warhammer Universe fantasy, and then 40K is the science fiction version.
And they're pretty much, mirrors of each other.
similar games.
And it goes back to that white dwarf mentality, right?
Yep.
It's kind of like the same idea.
Same thing. So that same year, they also released the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Basically, a role-playing game based around this universe, right?
Yeah, and it didn't. I don't know. I couldn't quite follow the history of that very well because that ultimately spins up and ends up in. It ultimately ended up in FFG's hands, didn't it? Where they had the.
I remember them printing that recently.
They got the
a couple
rights to
years
print
ago.
it for a little while, and so I don't know if there's a long storied history of Warhammer, or if it's just that everybody was playing D&D and then also playing Warhammer miniatures on the side.
Well, and I think that's with this, right? It's like you can imagine you have bought all these models, painted them, put them together. You have these armies, and then it's like, oh, here's another way you can use these models.
Yeah.
Right? We now have a role-playing system that you can plug all of this stuff that you've been building right into.
40K launches the same year I am born. Whoa. By the way, so that puts a little perspective on some things here.
Yeah,
That's
it's
just wild.
It's crazy.
And
So
yet here I am thinking I know anything.
So now it's 87. You have Fantasy, you have 40K, you have Citadel, who's making models, you have Citadel, who's making paints. And
You have some Games Workshop stores. More have happened around the area.
Yeah, they're expanding.
You got
doing
White
that whole
Dwarf
thing.
going.
And you can start seeing that they're a critical component of this hobby change, right? Because back then too, there are Games Workshop stores. At some point, they start allowing their products in other stores, or other stores start wanting to carry their products. And I'm always really fascinated by both 40K and Magic and the early days of hobby shops and comic shops and hobby stores kind of making the transition into the industry that we see now, which is there are a lot of stores that are primarily tabletop gaming focused. And so this is really starting to lay the groundwork for that to even be possible, right? You have these games with lots of releases, with lots of support, with this ability to build communities. And so it's trying to get back to this point in your brain when that doesn't exist, and just thinking about the lack of internet and announcements and information.
That magazine was everything.
Yellow Pages, the magazine though.
Right, like you imagine the power of that White Dwarf magazine. You could launch anything to exactly everybody.
And having your ad in that magazine is a big deal.
And you don't have to pay anything for it. It's your stuff, right?
It's your. I mean, they're doing the content that's marketing their products. That's building their communities.
Tell me about HeroQuest, 1991.
Well, I was going to say, so then they go on a slew, right? So HeroQuest, Space Crusade, Space Hulk, whole bunch of other things like that. But HeroQuest, you have some ties to this.
HeroQuest, I got this one year for Christmas, probably in 91 or 92, but it was essentially a hybrid game. You're both essentially role-playing and or playing a miniatures game. You have a DM, the game master or whatnot, who's doing all the things to oppose the lead characters, but you can either play just as a barbarian, an elf, a dwarf, or a wizard, and it was just good.
Like Golden Axe on the table, right?
Exactly. It was almost exactly like Golden Axe on the table, but it was very streamlined, clean, and fun, and you didn't have to like really inundate yourself with rules. So if you wanted to get your feet wet, you could, and it was, I think, linked with Hasbro, so it was this mass market thing that was trying to really start bringing worlds together in terms of, are you the hobby gaming enthusiast, or are you just kind of looking for something for your grandson this Christmas kind of a thing? Well,
here it is.
Both. And I had a lot of fun with that thing.
From what I can tell, HeroQuest and even Space Crusade may be even a better example of what I'm going to say, but is a board game that has a lot of elements from 40K, but is simplified and in a box. And like we've started to see this kind of a movement now, again, where it's like, well, for people to understand and get into this, or for mass market chains like Target or Barnes & Noble to sell this, we need
You need to walk them through it slowly. We need to start rather than just like the full experience.
Yeah, so they start doing that, but then probably more notably for them as a company, this is when Citadel and Games Workshop kind of come back together, and then in '94 they go public.
I think this may be one of the most important things in the entire timeline as compared to a lot of other game manufacturers and producers and just hobbyists, that kind of thing. That shareholder kind of obligation, I think, is the beginning of where we start to see a lot of questionable decisions out of Games Workshop. I don't think it happens. I've heard that people say that third edition of Warhammer, I think it was Fantasy or 40K, it's very confusing still to me, all of that.
A lot of numbers floating around.
Was the last, they called it the last non-commercial edition. There was a switch that was like, this is now trying to be a mass market style product. And that's when they lost, some people.
Provide value for shareholders. And not
that's
just
the key, right?
For people that want to do great things.
That's the key.
So that's what, they go public, right? And I think there's a lot of interesting things happening to this, right? The industry is changing. This 94 is when they go public. That's a year after Magic comes out. And I think you have a momentum going in tabletop gaming with Games Workshop, with Wizards coming along, and then Pokemon, and then all the games that would follow, and the board game renaissance, and Golden Age, and everything.
It's a short little time period, isn't it?
Yeah, really.
But the other thing that's happening in 94 is that the very start of what would become the dot-com bubble, what would become the technological revolution of the 2000s and phones
AOL.
And apps and all this, is starting to happen. So they're going public. The market's going from like super, super niche to like a real niche, like a real justified like thing that's happening. And so, they do some things. They release HeroQuest
Blood Bowl
2.
in 95.
They released Blood Bowl, which was super popular.
Everybody likes it.
Even Blood Bowl has if you're familiar with the industry at all, you eventually hear about Blood Bowl. And it's this game that came out, and then they stopped making it, and then the fans made it really popular and kept it going for a long time. And that's where you kind of start seeing Games Workshop doing what they became known for over the next 20 years, which is say nothing.
Pump and dump.
And it's like, hey, what are you doing with Blood Bowl? And they're just like, nothing. No movement, no whatever.
Word.
But they do Blood Bowl. They also launched like the Lord of the Rings strategy battle game. I remember seeing that Witch King on the Nazgul model, and I still
So
wanted
good.
actually to put it together.
It's an impressive figure.
And they had the technology changed as well. In the 2000s, they started switching to plastic miniatures, which lets them do more things with their models and more cost effective. Some interesting little highlights. There's like Dawn of War in 2004.
They start
That's
branching.
critical.
And it became a good underpinning for when a lot of the shoddy decision making on the tabletop front really started to shed their player base out because people were disinclined to keep participating in all this. But they were getting good licensing deals to a whole bunch of companies. Dawn of War was their 40K RTS, it was a great
They
game.
did THQ, I think, is who they
THQ,
were
exactly,
with. And didn't THQ do GoldenEye? Is that right?
Tony Hawk.
Tony Hawk. Oh,
Tony
even
Hawk.
better.
Oh, that's how you know
This is a
it.
real company. So they're making
Justified.
They actually, I looked at their list of video game properties, and it's immense. I mean,
Yeah.
it's crazy.
Yeah.
They ran
All
all the
kinds of
gamut from like
titles.
things that actually played like Warhammer, just on a computer screen, all the way to like your first-person shooters
Yeah,
and that
Fire
kind of
Warrior,
thing.
you're playing like this Tau, like Fire Warrior dude. It's amazing.
Was Dawn of War, is that the thing that we played at your place once or
You
twice?
probably played Dawn of War 2, but it was just
The
you know,
same idea.
successor. Yeah, you've got pick your 40K race, and you've got your Warlord or whatnot, whatever they're called, and on you go.
Incredible.
And so
Great.
around that time too, right? Is in the 2000s we had World of Warcraft.
2008. When did WoW launch?
I feel like that was
At least
was close.
2006,
It was earlier than that.
2005,
It was 2004. 2004.
I was
think
a
it was 04.
freshman in
That was
college. I think.
2004.
I think it was 03, 04.
Yes.
Yeah, good night. That's a different topic.
I think it was 05.
That's hilarious to think about.
that
what
would
was
have
it,
been your
Bryce?
senior year, 05.
2004.
Yeah, I
Oh,
think it's
September, November 2004. So
Late.
we're right there.
2004.
Yeah.
All right.
So that happens, right? And that leads to the next thing, which is they did Warhammer Online, which is an MMO that ultimately flopped.
But they also had a Sims Online.
There
so
was-
everybody was trying to shove something online.
The number of
It just didn't
MMOs that
always work.
tried and
just
failed
tried.
is just
Yeah.
unbelievable.
It's like the CCG
It
Gold
was.
Rush.
It really was.
That kind of a thing.
It's exactly what it
But
was.
this leads to really defining. I think there's a couple eras, right? There's the early stage, then there's the Fantasy 40K before going public stage, then there's the going public all the way until 2008, 2009. In 2008, 2009, this is after smartphones are becoming a thing, iPhone's out,
Yeah.
internet's super widely accessible, computers are everywhere, digital is happening. But this is where just some
Things get a little weird.
weird things are happening, right? So
Lines are drawn.
as
here.
we talked about in the history of Covenant cast several
I guess
episodes
we
ago.
started about that time. didn't we?
We started in 2007,
Barack Obama.
and so in 2007,
That's so crazy.
probably about like 2008, 2009, yeah,
It's like 1,000 years ago.
It's 1,000
it
years
was
ago.
basically another lifetime ago. But when we started, there was definitely a reputation around 40K and Games Workshop.
Oh, yeah.
And not just the company, but the community. And it was this, I remember,
The game
'cause
itself,
we
yeah.
came in through a side door, which is the CCG market. But then we got into Monster Apocalypse in
The
2000.
LCG
yeah.
side door was the real key.
Yeah,
We snuck in the sneak door.
Then the 2009 is when 2009 is when we really got into Monster Apocalypse,
Right.
which was a collectible miniatures game, pre-painted, pre-assembled.
Can you imagine?
But that inevitably led us, because that was made by Privateer Press, that got us in familiarity with like War Machine Hordes, and then it was like, what is this thing?
Putting models together.
Like putting models together.
Who would do
painting,
it?
Hobby.
Hard pass.
And so we opened our retail store in 2012, our physical location, and we had War Machine Hordes.
Brick and mortar.
Brick and mortar. And started really getting introduced to this hobby. But I remember from 2008 or 9 on, the like my appreciation of Games Workshop was very particular, right? Which was that they're kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Here, let me actually read you something.
Yeah, it was the most expensive, most involved, most technical, just all the superlatives you ultimately, certainly looking back on it, just don't want. And it's amazing that it was actually as much of a behemoth, and that this was essentially their zenith.
Yeah.
Right here.
Right
this is
there.
when they're cresting and start.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, going in a different direction.
Let me hit you with a couple of things. First of all, they got 2009 is when they start sending those cease and desists to fan sites. Don't use our stuff, our images. Don't just stop. It's intellectual property. It's ours. Only we can use it. 2011 was Maelstrom Games announcing that they had changed the terms.
So the terms went from they started getting really restrictive, right?
Yeah.
Like really protective of their rights. So that was the you can only sell the game in your region.
Right.
So, if they were a UK-based local and online retailer of 40K, and they got basically a cease and desist that said, you can't sell this outside Europe anymore.
Right.
And that was the beginning of a whole lot of this
That kind of
thing.
started the idea.
The hammer fell.
Terms,
But
updates.
there's a great article on Vice. They have a little waypoint kind of sub section, which actually I saw they were playing with Adam Coble, Dungeon World. I saw it the other day, and it's like we buy our Burning Wheel set from him at the booth at Gen Con. It's really cool. But this is what the author Ian Williams, he said up front. He said, if you're familiar with Games Workshop and its Warhammer franchise, what does the company actually mean to you? I'll take a guess. Expensive miniatures, bloated rules, ruthless trademark trolling, and aggressive disdain for customers. That's the reputation they made for themselves in recent years, and that's the reputation that 40K's revolutionary new 8th edition has to shoulder, overcome, and perhaps even change. And at this point, authors' names stopped appearing in the rule books.
Ooh.
That's the level of
consolidation.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Well, and that's
Hello.
so the era that's kind of being outlined to me is like somewhere between 2005 and 2008 is the start of the I call it the Tom Kirby was the CEO at the time era, and that's where you have the cease and desist happening. I remember watching there was a War Store video because they were a big Canadian retailer. They could only sell to Canada now and not in the U.S. And then not only that, but it just kept getting tighter and tighter, right?
Can you imagine being that business?
It was like, well, now to sell online, you have to have a physical location that's open at least this many hours, and you have to buy this much stuff, and you can only sell. At some point, it was like you can only sell this much of it online. It's this
ratio.
Yeah, this ratio. So all this stuff, but the other things that are kind of marked by that era, right, was like this general idea that like they didn't want to interact with their community at all. So they started a Facebook page, and then because of the moves they're making, there's a lot of negativity surrounding it, and they get a lot of bad comments. And then it's like Facebook page disappears.
Yeah.
Instead, they do
disappears.
They just
They
get rid of
take
it.
all their social media stuff down.
And then instead, they create Facebook pages for each of their stores separately. So it kind of diffuses all the conversation, right? They also... There were weird things happening, like people didn't know when products were releasing, stores didn't, so it'd be like a week before it comes out. And to sell their products, you have to agree to have this much retail space dedicated to them, and how many of the products you have to buy. So it's like a week before it comes out, you have to buy this many. Here's a new product. Thank you much.
I was reading horror stories about these retail store owners that they'd have customers come in and say, "Oh, hey, will you have the new X, Y, and Z model box kit, etc."
Yeah.
And retailers basically saying, what do you know about it? And then they're saying, well, we heard through like the rumor channels and whatnot that it's coming out on Friday. And the retailer's like, it probably is. And if it is, I'll have them. Like that kind of thing. And then you'd get notice like, okay, tomorrow, place your order, and then
Or
it'll be
maybe
there on
like
Friday.
Monday or
kind of thing.
Tuesday. It's a week up.
It's
Like,
all
that-
parenthetical with maybe, possibly, it could happen.
I don't know if that's still if that kind of understanding of how a company should operate in terms of getting things to retail is still just kind of, is there a hangover currently over the industry? Because that's still happening, right?
100%.
That idea that we're not going to give you any information and then here's products and deal with it is crazy, right? Like no other industry. Is that exclusive to the tabletop industry? Does that come from Games Workshop?
I haven't worked in a lot of other industries, but it is definitely a legacy feature of the gaming industry, which is very unfortunate because it's essentially, the implied attitude with Games Workshop to those retailers. It's just complete arrogance at worst,
buy it anyway,
but indifference at best. And neither are good, and it just creates all these entanglements where it's like, if we could maybe work together and coordinate, everybody would be happier, more effective, et cetera, and we would all prosper together.
Everyone would do better, the whole industry would. But I think that's where, you can easily see how this happens, which is you go from the 70s and 80s when like, how did communication happen, right? It was like, do you call in your orders as a retailer, right? And that's a big reason the distributors exist in the first place, is to be that person in the middle who can handle all that.
Yeah.
But like really, to me, when I look at the list of how they were handling business and how they were doing things during that era, right, that 2005 to 2015 space, it really just seems like a company that came in with a preconceived notion about how business was done.
Like an 80s level notion?
80s level notion, didn't adopt, didn't evolve with the times and use technology in their favor, right? And also came into that era with a lead. Where it's like, you're a retailer, you make so much of your money off of what we're doing. you're going to deal with it.
Yeah, you owe us kind of a thing.
Well, and the retailer doesn't want to not have it, right? If I
Correct.
have 20, 40K players, I got to
need to
have the
carry
product
it.
when
Yep.
it comes out.
Let me tell you, this will give you some context into Kirby. This is his chairman preamble, essentially before he gets the boot. This is 28th of July on 2014.
So this is about 6 months before he's gone.
Just get a feel for his take on this. So they're talking about 3D printing. The shareholders have raised concerns. What
Give us
about
a
3D printing?
A timestamp on this?
2014, July 20th.
All right.
He says, one day 3D printers will be affordable. Agreed. They are now. They will be able to produce fantastic details. The affordable ones won't. And they will do it faster than 1 miniature per day. No, they won't. Look it up. So we may get to the time when someone can make a poorly detailed miniature at home and have enough for an army in less than a year. That presupposes that 3D scanning technology will be affordable and good enough. Don't bet the mortgage on that one. And that everyone will be happy to have nothing but copies of old miniatures. This is the CEO of the company in 2014 with a level of arrogance that I can only imagine led to a
breathtaking.
lot of the things that we're seeing now.
Yeah.
I mean, you put I wouldn't bet the mortgage on that one in a preamble to your shareholder report.
Yeah.
That's just what I you
Yeah,
get
well,
a feel. You get a feel for that.
As a company who's making the vast majority of its money off of selling three-dimensional objects, 3D printing has got to be, you have to at least be aware of it and like willing to say, man, if it's just hypothetically, if 3D printing
there. We'd be there.
got good enough, fast enough, and cheap enough, we would be having problems.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you're not considering as CEO of that company, how your business may need to be prepared for that moment in time, that's just arrogant. That is just straight.
Let me put a little addition to that, because he does go on to address that.
Yeah, sauce it up.
And
Man, give me more.
says that will not happen in the next few years, or in city speak, forever. But if and when it does, it will just mean that we can cut yet more costs out of the supply chain and be making good margins selling Citadel 3D printers.
Whoa.
So take that for what you will.
There you go.
All right. But that luckily for Games Workshop, because like I remember back we opened our local retail store in 2012, 13, 14, 15's coming around, and by like 2014, it was just like assumed. It's like Games Workshop is doing this incorrectly, and their reputation is now preceding them. Where retailers are, they're starting to be other companies coming along, whether it's board games or other miniatures games or card games.
Right?
And so a whole lot of people enter the scene. The industry's growing, and it's like you look at Games Workshop versus, as an example, 2012 Star Wars X-Wing comes out, and this is a pre-painted miniatures game for Star Wars.
Way
one of the
cheaper
biggest
to play.
license.
Yeah.
Way cheaper to play. Way easier to start playing. And as we talked about on the State of Tabletop, walks in.
Takes the number one spot.
Takes the crown.
The crown.
Yeah.
And I think that is another contributing factor to the kind of leadership change that had to happen at Games Workshop for them to be relevant. But, it was like back then, before it all started changing, that's what we're about to start hitting on, I didn't think it was likely possible or expected for them to change.
Yeah.
It was just like, this is how they operate.
We kind of just assumed they were tanking.
That's their culture. This is how they've done it, and will continue to do it until they're gone.
Yeah, because change is rare.
Yeah. Or more
that
to say,
level, right?
just so exceedingly difficult.
and change on time.
when it's
especially.
institutionalized like that.
2015, January, Kevin Roundtree becomes new CEO. The board puts a new CEO in place, and things dramatically change. So you see them start a Facebook page again. You see them start interacting with the community, asking feedback. They're announcing product months in advance.
Another important name here is Robert Decker. Everybody points to this guy. He's the first guy hired by the new CEO, and he was the marketing and merchandising manager. First guy comes in and apparently leads this entire marketing push to open them back up to their community.
Even now, I mean, they added a community site. They restarted the White Dwarf. They have this painting tutorials and videos going up like every day. They're creating content. They're engaging. They also back in the Kirby era, weren't all their YouTube videos didn't allow comments.
Yeah.
And so it was like they just did not want to interact. If you emailed them, maybe get a response, maybe not.
Yeah.
Just like very, very crazy. And so now Games Workshop, they did a couple other things on the timeline to mention, which is new CEO in 15. That summer they put out Age of Sigmar, which
What a
was
big deal.
controversial, right?
Oh,
so
of course.
Warhammer Fantasy, the first big, the game that they put out.
The game.
apparently the story, the campaign in that was, as they were leading to Age of Sigmar, was the end of times, right?
Yeah.
It was like everyone's going away, everyone's dying.
Yeah, the world's destroyed.
Yeah.
And so it restarts with Age of Sigmar, but I remember when this came out.
Oh, of course.
And people were like, what are you doing? Because it was like no point cost on models.
Yeah.
The rules were like 4 pages instead of like a 300-page rulebook, right? And there was a lot of people who were upset that fantasy was getting killed. But that was really, I think, a sign of the moves that would eventually come. A couple years later, they put an 8th edition of 40K this past June.
By the way, apparently when Sigmar dropped, all their total revenue, fantasy accounted for about 17% of it.
Wow.
So to give you an idea of where that is.
So Age of Sigmar, apparently, from everything I can gather, was basically just a simplified, much easier game that you could potentially buy. You still had to put the models together and stuff, but like be playing way quicker. They had the rulebook online instead of having to buy the
Codex.
big codexes and stuff.
So think about, I was watching a YouTube video, the Tabletop Minion, I think, is that the guy's name?
Yeah, he was really good videos.
So he was basically explaining, here's how it looked to start playing Warhammer 40K, for instance. You go into the shop and you're like, hey, I like these things. These look nice, right? And it's like, what do I got to do
it's like, oh, I like these.
to get my
these
friend
First,
into this?
sell a major organ.
And it's like, yeah, well, here's the core rule book that you need. Here's the codexes that you need. The models are $80 a box. You've got to get paints. You got glue. And it's like, well, I didn't bring $7,000 down to the store today, and I've got a $20 allowance. So what am I supposed to do? So you just lose every potential new player, and that's what they were seeing, is all their old players had all the models and were fine playing, and then there were no new players. So they just kept losing players. You can see that happening in any kind of game. And you need a way to get into this game as easy as possible. And what Games Workshop was unwilling to give up so far is the modeling aspect. They're trying to make it as easy as possible to do the modeling rather than cutting the modeling piece out like X-Wing and a lot of these next level miniatures games are doing.
Yeah.
Will that work, I think, is the ultimate question moving forward to 2015, 2020, 2025. Like, can you have a successful miniatures game at this point in time that still is so heavily focused on modeling? Is there enough hobbyists out there to support a community anymore?
Well, and the data we were looking at State of Tabletop, Games Workshop was still number 2 with 40K. And it makes sense on a practical level, right? When you have X-Wing, that is such an easy game to learn and play, that offers strategic depth, that also doesn't require the modeling aspect, of course more people are likely to want to play this game. And it's Star Wars, right? So I don't think, actually, the fact that they were number 1 for so long kind of reminds me of the iPhone being number 1 for so long, which is like, they both got to be the super nuanced, high profit margin game and high volume game, and didn't have anyone occupying the spaces of the easier games to get into.
Yeah.
Right.
No real competition.
It just makes sense, right? It's like it's the reality that Starbucks gets more customers than like the local coffee shop next door that's doing espresso only, because like it is built for a wider audience.
Yeah, streamlined, as it were.
But that's I think a great question, which is like, what is there an audience big enough to keep the hobby going, so to speak? Or what needs to be done for that hobby to continue?
The focus is just kind of misplaced. So for us, we've always been interested in the game, right? But for us, the hobby is playing the game.
Yeah.
For a lot of people, the hobby was construction, painting,
even customizing your models.
Customizing models. And this came out of pre-Games Workshop times when you would get together and train collecting. This kind of thing where you just have your modeling, basically. You're putting models together. And that, I think the general sense of modeling as a hobby has certainly gone out of favor culturally.
Yeah.
Right? You're a young kid and you're putting together your model cars and your model trains and these kinds of things. I don't think that that's a part of the culture so much anymore. But certainly within our genre, within our niche, that I think is where it can survive and continue. And I think that Games Workshop is focused on that side of the equation rather than it is making the greatest possible rule set that it can. And I think that's why Sigmar is like, let's pull back so much of the complexity that really doesn't matter whenever we're all about the models, the painting,
the story,
the story.
And even some of the major shortcomings of Age of Sigmar, namely that there weren't initially point values associated with anything. That was a major upset with a lot of the traditional players, but they countermanded that. They corrected that. They issued a new publication. It's like, okay, here's your point value, so you can still have tournament play and all these kinds of things that you've grown well accustomed to.
Probably a sign of that new CEO, that executive
And I think that's
change.
exactly it, which is before they would have just said,
this is how it is, deal with it.
And now it's they're listening, they're interacting. So, looking at it and kind of stepping back, I would be curious to know, where you guys see Games Workshop over the next 5 or 10 years. And are the changes enough? Were they fast enough? Because I do think that the hobby element, even the idea of building miniatures and building models, is something that a lot of people do enjoy, right? As a person who likes to play games, I would much prefer even a starter set that is pre-assembled, like the resin pre-assembled. We sell that with like a Guild Ball or even X-Wing, where I can get to the table faster. And then once I know I like the game, I might be willing to buy models that I put together and have to spend this time on. And I definitely don't want to take that hobby away from people that really enjoy it. But what do you think the shape of that kind of miniature game is over the next 5 or 10 years?
Oh, that's a really good question.
I mean, I firmly believe that the assembling, painting, the hobby element of a would-be miniature game is an inherent obstacle in terms of its success. It is essentially a 2-for-1 deal that you may not necessarily want to sign up for. It's like, I would just like to play the game and not have to do all this essentially, because I'm just interested in the game, work to get to that point. And there's usually going to be and higher cost associated, all these kinds of things that build into that because the models are more complex, et cetera. But all that to say, if you really want to keep your game of interest to the general public, which I think is essential so that you, as we talked about in our sustainability podcast, always have more people coming in than you have leaving, there's no other way to get around that. I mean, you just have to play fundamentals of, particularly in this day and age, how convenient and how much bang for not the buck, but the hour, the minute am I getting out of this thing? Even Hallmark games like Twilight Imperium, generally one of the biggest things to get past is, well, the setup time is 60 to 90 minutes. And that's got to be factored into this whole experience. So if I can sit down and have a game of X-Wing up and running in 15 to 20, the game only takes an hour and the rules are relatively tighter, I think it's just a given that it's eventually going to displace any other game that doesn't have these fundamental aspects of what makes a game readily accessible, appreciable, and affordable.
I think that
time and money-wise.
There's definitely, in terms of audience, there's got to be a much bigger audience of people who would play a game versus who would paint a miniature, right? Just in terms of the general public, like I could probably get 100 people to play X-Wing for every one person I could get to paint a model, right? I mean, I don't know really where the numbers are, but I feel like it's a drastically larger group of people that would sit down and play versus sit down and paint, or even worse,
with X-Wing.
glue together and paint. But what I do think the Games Workshop can do is it can continue to get those people involved with their property. And I think that Games Workshop has an inherent advantage. The traditional miniatures model has a huge advantage in that people are just so much less likely to leave once they're in. Because you have so much sweat equity invested in your collection that like you really don't want to just leave. Because this is really important. You've invested a lot of yourself in this hobby. So if they can switch and really make their marketing about how awesome it is to be into the hobby of miniatures. And we've seen this, right? We've seen they're now doing like once a day painting tutorials on their website. They're doing these like starter bundles that are way cheaper for your initial X number of models. They've got their paint bundles together. In their stores, they have a huge paint nights, paint day, paint competitions. They're focusing more and more on the hobby aspects of it. And I think that's absolutely the way to go. I think they should understand that they have maybe the best non-super iconic universe. Star Wars, everybody knows. Lord of the Rings, everybody knows. But then there's also like Warhammer. Like most people have some familiarity with it, so licensing it out to video games is great. But taking that core property and saying, this is about the hobby element. We'll make the game good too, and we'll continue to improve it. But it is about hobby
first.
And we're going to make our stores about that, our website about that, and everything about this game about those miniatures.
And we snuck a peek at that Nagash model that they put out for Age of Sigmar, and this thing is elaborate, ornate, and just giant and beautiful. And if they, like you're saying, play to that strength. There's always been that just kind of like, factor. Like, you see the Witch King model, you see all this kind of stuff. I remember seeing like a Tzinch Herald or something like that for a fantasy game from Games Workshop, and it was just like, well, what's that from? And what's it for? And what's it about? And I want to know everything because it's just so awesome. But yeah, I think that is an excellent foil to that, but they really have to have their min-maxing plan tight, laid out, and all that kind of thing, because it's still going to be an uphill battle, I would think.
And that's where Shadespire fits into this too. The newest thing that they've released, this much smaller kind of skirmish style game, but you still get your foot in the door of hobby stuff. I think you need like 2 or 3 models, maybe a few more, but it's a small amount certainly compared to a normal game of anything that had come previously. So it's trying to remove that barrier a little bit, but it's not saying we don't like the modeling aspect. It's saying we're just going to make modeling as easy as we can make it because they think that there's enough people out there that are into that, and I think they're right.
Sure.
And I think there could be a lot more people into it that are not currently. They're just not getting spoken to right now.
Yeah. Sure.
And they're not even in the industry right now. They're out there completely oblivious to Warhammer.
Yeah.
So if they can get them and say, craft something, make it your own, customize this piece, and then you might even, if you want to, use it in a game. Like, how cool is that? Have these battles. That's the way I would come at it if I were Warhammer.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And I also like they did a 40K kill team, which is like a skirmish. It's way smaller.
Yeah.
Which I think is very clever to basically stair-step people in, where it's like, hey, you need 3 or 4 models. Just get there. And then it's like, now we can talk about getting 200 things painted up. But I also think, you mentioned their universe being their own. And it's not licensed, it's not Star Wars, it's not any of these other things. So
FFG did have it for a while.
Well, they had it for certain types of products. But the other element to me of that hobby is I would be, they did the Lord of the Rings game. But if you're going to really triple down on getting people into the hobby of miniatures, I would not mind seeing, because I know the 40K universe for some people is off-putting to a certain degree, right? It's darker,
very dark,
it's aggressive, it's violent. So I would be curious to see if they ever, it's grim. I'd be curious if they will ever put out, and I half expect that they will, other universes or lines, and not even just go grab this license over here, but like make a new world. Tell a new story. And then, of course, one thing I'm more and more interested in as I get older is campaign story-driven play being integral to the whole thing.
Yeah.
Where it's make it about the story, not about the balance of the top-tier stuff. And they've done a pretty good job of that over the time anyway.
Great story,
and
honestly.
the last piece of this that I think kind of makes it all work together with a traditional miniatures game that is so fascinating to me is that you have an incredible incentive for a store to really lead the way on this. That you have that need to teach somebody how to put a model together, right? Like that's a skill that you really, if you have mentors around, if you have somebody who can show you how to prime a model and paint, we've got like James in the store who is always there, and I've seen him do airbrushing and whatnot for people who are just getting into miniatures games. And that's incredibly helpful to have a local community that's really strong. On the other end, though, you can do the modeling aspect completely by yourself and have a great time, which you can't do with a card game.
No.
Like I could deck build for a while, but
hey, you could play Lord of the Rings solo.
That's true. That's true. So it's both a hobby that is really awesome solo and really necessary to be done in a group where you can have this kind of mentorship going on. So the retail store is very important to the traditional miniatures model, and Games Workshop has, at this point, 315 of them, by the way.
It's a lot of stores.
Not bad at all.
Yeah. There's a whole lot of stores.
That is a whole lot.
That also makes me want to just note really quick before we get off of the Games Workshop topic and go to the questions, is the reality of one really huge upside to the whole hobby side of this hobby is that it can be done alone. Right? Which is people that have kids or people that don't have a big play group can paint the models and then they can go to the conventions or they can go to the weekly league night and then meet up with people. So it does, unlike, an X-Wing, where it's like, and there are people that have designed systems to potentially play that either online or by yourself. It's like, there's really not much to do about X-Wing when you're just at home by yourself and like building a list build, right? As much as like 40K, a lot of people go home at night, a couple hours a night, they're just doing art, basically, right? That's what the hobby is. You're literally doing an artistic expression on a 3-dimensional object. So that is one really cool part of that hobby that I think is worth at least pointing out.
So can we just get can we go around the table? I want to get a conclusion from everybody. Given the entire timeline, you have the rise, the dip, the potential rise again in 2015, new leadership, new CEO, extreme community connection, a lot of talking. Like they published this FAQ, by the way. I have this note, and that one of the questions in their FAQ is, "Why should I trust you?" Mm-hmm. And it says, that. "Come on, this is the new Games Workshop." So they're even branding it.
TM.
Yeah, TM. Seriously though, everything we're talking about now is an extension of all the community engagement work we've been doing over the last year and a half. We've learned a lot from you guys and gals, and we've tried really hard to make sure everything you've asked for is included. And if we've missed something, drop us a line on the Facebook page and let us know. We'll make sure your requests are given proper consideration.
That's such a different tone.
It's a 180,
yeah.
Complete 180. So that's where we are, and we have the Shade Spire is now happened, which we apparently need to really take a look at, and should, and do, and will, and et cetera.
Et cetera.
So where does that leave Games Workshop?
My take is, I think they've done a 180. I think that they have a lot of potential moving ahead in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I will not be surprised to see them continue being successful. I do think, though, for them to regain, if it's something they even care to regain, the number one slot on the miniatures list in the industry, they're going to have to do something else. I don't think that the games they're offering and the hobby they're offering right now can ever be as big as pre-assembled, pre-painted miniatures done correctly.
That's a statement there.
And so I am not sure what that looks like, whether it's things for 40K, a starter set that is pre-assembled, maybe even pre-painted, go crazy. I don't know what it looks like, but I know that now given that they are willing to listen and they're changing, I will not be surprised over the next couple of years they've been working on whatever the next thing is.
Yeah.
Because the next thing hasn't come out from them in a long time. They've been doing new editions of 40K. They did the Age of Sigmar, which is the new edition of Fantasy.
Essentially.
They did Shadespire, which is like an intro to 40K, basically,
and a great little skirmish game.
Yeah.
And but like, when was the last time they put something out that changed the game?
Yeah.
They had, you see this all the time within the industry where someone gets ahead, and it's like, well, why did Walkman not do the iPod, right? Or why did
Apple not do the home speaker 6 years ago?
Yeah. Or why did Motorola not do the iPhone? Right. It's like they were so far ahead, they shouldn't have lost. But you have a company that was really far ahead, got kicked in the teeth a little bit by the times and by competitors, but also didn't just go down.
Yeah.
Right. They found their footing and they're potentially marching back. So I think they're worth watching, and I'm curious to see what they do. But I honestly, I don't know what their mission is and what their goals are and where they're trying to get. But I do see a company that could be way more successful than they currently are. And they're making a lot of good choices to get there.
Yeah, so far. What do you think, Robert?
I think that the changes that they've implemented are sound. They make a lot of sense in terms of overcoming some of the fundamental roadblocks that they had, namely tightening up the rules, making it more approachable, less intimidating, that kind of a thing. But akin to what I said, and Zach as well, this whole 2-for-1 business with having to both have the hobby, painting, and assembly business, as well as being competent and having the time to play a longer than average game, it's very demanding in, I think, today's society, and people are going to make more economical decisions with their time and money. So if they want to continue permutating with how they can make this more consolidated up to and including perhaps doing, if not pre-painted, at least pre-assembled miniatures or less complex to assemble miniatures, those kinds of things, that would be a huge step, because even the things that came out of the HeroQuest box, they weren't the most glorious models for sure, but they were good enough and table ready if you just put a little bit of time and attention to the painting. But they got seemingly a new, hungry, innovative team, and I think they have certainly the clout, the brand presence, and all that kind of a thing to catalyze most anything that they wanted to do and have a very good crack at success.
And I'll tag into that just a little bit, which is to say that part of making the hobby even more accessible with pre-assembled models, right, is that it only really matters if you want to get a whole lot more people into this hobby.
Yeah.
Because if it's too difficult, right, the number of people that aren't even in tabletop games right now, that there's no way they would ever get into 40K.
Correct.
Is a large number of people. And I think the hobby's great. I think once people get comfortable doing it, I've seen so many people get into painting who weren't into it. But they had to have someone to hold their hand because it was so complicated.
Yep.
And so if you can remove those barriers, I think you could explode the hobby side of this if it's done correctly.
Yeah, I agree.
It can also be that what they need is just a more robust tabletop gaming hobby on the whole, which they now have. So when you have more and more people getting into the genre through board games, they don't necessarily have to be the entry point of their own properties anymore. So if you can have, I think obviously some kind of a big, and maybe their stores will do it, but the local retail segment is seeing a lot of movement right now. We see Warhammer Cafe apparently is launching in the
I saw that
US,
post about
right?
that.
So we have this kind of that, and that idea honestly feels a little bit old to me right now, for whatever reason. I mean, it's just, I don't know, it's cafe. You play games in it. What's the big deal? But so
different cast.
They're doing the cafe model, and people are kind of experimenting with how the space should be run. But if the retail space or if the play space can become something that is very attractive and appealing to a lot of people, and then you can have entry-level games like an X-Wing or a board game that gets people into the store and starts playing, and then all of a sudden they can look over and say, what is that model?
Yeah.
Now you've gotten a lot more movement, you've got a lot more ability to have a very niche kind of game that just has way more exposure by way of other tabletop
By way
games.
of the industry growing. And I think that's a really good point, which is they don't need to be the entry point to tabletop for people, right? Catan and Ticket to Ride and board games and
Love
X-Wing
Letter.
and all this can get them. Love Letter can get them in. It's growing the industry, and I think the changes they made are very helpful in helping people get in. But I think that there is still a bridge in between even X-Wing and 40K that currently does not exist, and either they're going to build it or someone else is going to build it. Down
or
to
nobody's wanting to
build
cross
it and they will come.
Maybe that's the thing. But positive movement. It's just great to see this on the whole. And I guess the one caution that I will put out there, just because I don't necessarily believe this, but
gonna be prophetic.
anytime you have an organization that does this kind of a flip and potentially overdoes it on listening to the community, the fan base, the player base, etc., they a lot of the times will never be the innovators anymore. Right? Because you're just trying to catch up to what your players are saying you're failing at and trying to do better.
The leadership role has changed.
Yeah. And there's this classic quote, you ask, what do you want? I want a faster horse, and then instead of the car, right? Like that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So I think they should be careful about that. And Age of Sigmar tells me that they're not necessarily afraid to take chances and then also respond by listening. So I think they're in a good spot. I'm curious. It's fun to go from somebody who I just don't even think about in any kind of positive light to now like, oh, keep my eyes on this company.
Yeah,
Totally.
and it's cool to watch a change like that happen is hopeful.
Positive for everyone.
All right, we're gonna dance along here to some questions. You can use Ask Covenant to get your question answered right here on the show. First one comes from the show familiar Alan Jones. He has a question: as brick and mortar store owners, where do you see the line between responsibility of the customers to support the store and the store's responsibility to provide a space? Many owners assume the space requires the sales, where on the flip side, many customers assume the store is there for them regardless if they buy anything. Where is the balance in your eyes?
After all of this talk, we got to cover this. This is a 17-hour discussion.
Woo!
Here, let me.
This has been on the list for a little.
It has, and it's so important, and we do need to just. Aren't we doing a retail store cast at some point in the near future?
Yeah.
So here's a little sneak peek, at least, at my thoughts on this front. It's a pretty simple equation. Where are things adding value in the equation? And if a store, the thing is, the store used to be the place where you had to go, 1975, to find Dungeons & Dragons, to find people who like Dungeons & Dragons, to find the products themselves. That is not at all the case anymore. We have Facebook groups, forums, digital products, Amazon's,
Friendster,
e-commerce retailers. I mean, we're selling stuff online. You can get everything that we sell anywhere in the world. So you don't need the store for any of its traditional functions that it originally set out to achieve. So how is the store adding value for you? And any retailer out there needs to think, how am I adding value to my customers? Because it is not a given that they have to come to me anymore. I can play a game a large number of places right now. So I think there's been a lot of taking that for granted, that there is no responsibility for the store, and it's just like, well, they've got to come here, and they should come here because I'm here. And it's like, well, that's just not really true anymore.
Check your entitlement at the door.
That's right.
Yeah, but I would say that when it comes to the key word here being responsibility, the customer has no responsibility. The customer will feel obliged to participate and spend money, that kind of a thing, like you're saying, if the establishment is adding value, but they have no obligation
Right.
to support this store and that kind of a thing. So if there's ever a business that has that kind of mentality, that is inherently antithetical and
failing.
backward and all this kind of a thing. But at the same time, a customer who is experiencing something that does add value that is greater than other mediums and that kind of a thing, though not a responsibility, it would make sense that they would support that thing because it is doing more than others are.
Absolutely.
There you have it.
Yeah,
All right.
we'll leave it there. We got way more on that, don't we?
We're going to get out of here. You'll catch more on that on our
coming up.
FLGS episode coming up. Meantime, we're going to ask you a question and would love to have your answer in the comments below. How do you feel about the recent changes at Games Workshop? Excited to read it. Thanks for watching. Until next time, keep playing.